He almost did not go into the kitchen at all. It was the innkeeper he wanted, a word about the north rooms and whether the party could be accommodated for a second night. Edmund Halford had sent Thomas ahead to inquire, and Thomas had not returned. So Edmund went himself, passing through the narrow passage behind the tap room, where a smell of wood smoke and something roasting caught the cold air, and the light from an oil lamp threw its warmth against the plaster walls. He was not attending to the room. His mind was on the road to Thornwick Grange, on the morning's meeting with the tenant agent, on the letter from Beecham he had not yet answered about the Portia Wren business. He pushed open the kitchen door. A woman stood at the far end of the room with her back to him, transferring something from a copper pot to a larger vessel, her arms moving in the particular economical way of someone who had done the same work 10,000 times. Her hair was dark, caught up in a plain cotton cap. Her gown was gray wool, serviceable, worn at the elbows. She was thin in the way of women who eat after the work is done, rather than before. He was about to speak when something stopped him. The line of her shoulders. The particular angle of her head when she tilted it to check the liquid's thickness. The way her left hand braced against the pot rim, thumb inward, a small habit he had spent 10 years trying to forget because it had appeared to him in every dream where he had been briefly allowed to believe she was still alive. He said her name. He did not mean to say it aloud. It came from somewhere below intention. She went perfectly still. Then she turned, and he saw her face for the first time in 10 years and 3 months, and she saw his, and she dropped the ladle onto the flagstones and ran. If you have ever wondered what it is to lose someone, and then find them again in a kitchen in Thornwick, stay close. This is where Cecily's story and Edmund's finally catch up to one another. Edmund Halford had been 38 years old in the late autumn of 1816 when his party stopped at the Crossed Keys Inn on the road through Derbyshire, and the story of how he came to be there was a decade in the making. He had been 28 when he married her. That was the plain fact at the center of everything. The way a stone at the bottom of a river is the center of everything that moves around it. He had been 28, and she had been 18. And the marriage had been arranged by their respective fathers in the sensible way of such arrangements, a question of joined land and cleared debt, and 2 families whose fortunes made geometric sense together. He had not expected to like her. He had not expected much at all. He had liked her immediately. She had appeared in his library on the occasion of their first formal meeting, escorted by her father and a thin-faced aunt, and she had looked at the shelves rather than at him for the first 17 seconds, which he had counted. And when she finally looked at him, she had said, with the particular directness of someone who had decided lying was more effort than it was worth, that she found arranged marriages absurd, but acknowledged they served a practical purpose, and that she intended to be honest with him always, which she hoped would make the practical purpose more bearable for them both. He had very nearly smiled. He had stopped himself because he was in the habit of stopping himself, a habit his mother had instilled early and which served him well in rooms where other men read everything. They had been married in October, a small ceremony at St. Margaret's with an October fog pressing against the windows and the vicar's breath visible in the cold air. Edmund had looked at her across the nave and thought, very clearly, that he was entirely unprepared for this particular woman, and that this was a thing he would need to manage carefully. He had held her hand in the carriage afterward, and she had looked out the window at the fog and said the light was beautiful, and he had not said anything. But he had thought about it for weeks afterward. The quality of a woman who finds an October fog beautiful. He had sent her on ahead to Halford Grange. That was the decision he had replayed in every version of the subsequent years, the precise hinge on which everything turned. He had affairs in London that required his presence for another 10 days. The Grange was already prepared. His housekeeper, Mrs. Norris, would receive her. He would follow within a fortnight. He had not followed within a fortnight. He had followed within 8 days, having settled matters faster than expected, driving north in high spirits, arriving at the Grange to find his new wife was not there. The physician's letter arrived the following morning. It was brief and clinical and final. The young Baroness Halford had taken a fever during the journey and had not recovered from it. The physician had done everything in his power. The body had been returned to the custody of her father, who was traveling with the party, as was correct and proper. He had signed the letter with a name Edmund could not afterwards recall with any precision. Edmund had written to the father. The father's reply was delayed and brief and strange. Edmund had written again. No reply came. He had sent Thomas to the father's address in Bath, and Thomas had found the house let to a different family. The father gone abroad. No forwarding direction left with the solicitors. Edmund had contacted those solicitors. They confirmed the father's departure and the settling of the estate, and they produced a death certificate bearing Cecily's name, duly witnessed and registered. And Edmund had sat with that document in his library for 3 days without speaking to anyone. He had searched afterward. He could not have explained why to anyone who asked, since the evidence was clear and the witnesses were credible and the certificate bore all the correct marks. He searched because he had spent 8 days in high spirits driving north, and he had arrived expecting to find her in the east parlor with an October fog outside and something to say about the quality of the light, and he had found nothing except cold rooms and a housekeeper who had not received word that the Baroness had ever set out. He had found no grave. He had traced the route of the journey, spoken to every innkeeper along the road, corresponded with churches in 4 counties. There was no grave because there had never been a funeral, because the father had settled matters in London with a bribed physician and a forged certificate and a paid witness, and had then removed himself to the continent with the marriage settlement intact and his debts cleared, and what happened to his daughter after the arrangement was made was not a thing he had attended to with any care. Edmund had not known any of this. He had found only absence, and after 3 years the searching had become a private wound he carried rather than a public activity, because he was a practical man, and the evidence was what it was. He had accepted it. He had not recovered from it. That was the difference, and it was important. Acceptance and recovery were not the same country. His mother had produced Portia Wren 2 years ago, in the way his mother produced things she had decided were necessary, which was with a combination of calm persistence and the faint implication that resistance would be considered tiresome. Portia was 23, and lovely in the conventional way, with good breeding and a pleasant disposition, and a mother who had assembled the match with the focused efficiency of someone who had wanted a barony in the family. For 15 years, Edmund had not refused. He had also not agreed. He had allowed the understanding to gather around him the way weather gathers, without actively calling it forward. The journey to Thornwick had been his mother's suggestion, and Mrs. Garth's execution. Mrs. Lavinia Garth, Portia's mother, had arranged to travel with his party under the banner of a Derbyshire cousin who required a visit, and it had been managed so neatly that Edmund had agreed before he fully understood what he had agreed to. Portia sat across from him in the carriage and looked at the Derbyshire landscape with the pleasantly attentive expression of a young woman doing everything correctly, and Edmund had looked out the other window and thought about the October fog and the woman who had found it beautiful and made himself stop. The Crossed Keys Inn appeared in the early evening, the sky going dark and cold, and Edmund had been relieved to step out of the carriage and have something to do with his hands. And then he had gone looking for the innkeeper and found someone else entirely. Cecily had run as far as the woodshed, which was the end of the yard, and stopped because there was nowhere further to go. She pressed herself against the shed wall in the dark with both hands flat on the cold timber and waited for her breath to come back. It would not come back. It kept seizing, short and ragged, the way it had in the first months after she understood what her father had done, when she would wake in the dark in whatever room she had found that week, and understand all over again that the life she had briefly held was gone. She had known this moment was possible. She had known it every day for 10 years, the way one knows about a thing that is unlikely but not impossible, and manages it by not thinking about it directly. She had simply not thought it would be here, in Thornwick of all places, in a kitchen she had come to think of as her own. The kitchen was her own. That was the small and sufficient life she had built. Agnes Croft and her husband kept the Crossed Keys with the affectionate chaos of people who loved the work more than they were suited to its management, and Cecily had arrived 7 years ago with a widow's fiction, a widow's gray gown, and a mathematical precision with figures that the Crofts had been in quiet need of for years. She managed their accounts. She ran the kitchen with the cook 2 mornings a week and alone on Saturdays. She knew which suppliers cheated on weight and which were honest. She had no wages beyond room, and her meals and a room under the eaves that was warm in winter, because the chimney ran through it. And she had been, if not happy, then settled, which was the best she had believed she deserved. She had been in the yard that afternoon, when the new party's groom came through to see about the horses. A man she did not know, compact and efficient, with the Lord's colors on his coat. She had been carrying the afternoon's bread from the bakehouse and had passed within 6 feet of him. He had not noticed her, or had noticed her only as one notices furniture. She had heard him say to the ostler, without malice, with the casual authority of a man accustomed to sorting the world into relevant and irrelevant, that the innkeeper's girl could show him the water trough when she was finished. She had thought nothing of it. She was the innkeeper's girl in all the ways that mattered to a man who had just arrived and needed his horses watered. She had shown him the water trough and returned to the kitchen without giving the exchange a second thought. She had not yet known who he served. She had not gone back. That was the decision she had made 10 years ago in a hired room in Shrewsbury, reading the document her father had forced a solicitor to execute before he fled. The annulment bore her name, and Edmund's name, and the date, and the proper legal language, and she had read it 3 times before she understood that her father had anticipated everything, had arranged everything, had taken the marriage settlement, and cleared his debts, and left her the document as the only proof of what she had once briefly been. The document said she was not his wife. It said the marriage had been dissolved on grounds that her father had invented, grounds that looked real on paper if one did not look at the physician's name too closely. She had been 20 years old. She had been ill, genuinely ill, with the real fever that had struck the party 2 days out of London, not the wasting sickness the physician had described to Edmund in his letter, but a real fever that had left her weak and slow and frightened. By the time she was well enough to think clearly, her father was gone, and she had the document in her hand, and she had thought, with terrible clarity, that returning to Edmund with a fraudulent annulment and a father who had stolen his money and a story that could only embarrass and entangle him was not a thing she could ask of him. He had mourned her, she supposed. The mourning would be over. He would have moved on because he was a practical man, and that was what practical men did. And she would not unravel a life she had no right to unravel. She had made herself believe that. She had maintained the belief for 10 years with the same economical persistence she brought to the accounts. And now he was in the kitchen. Lord Halford was in the kitchen, and she had seen his face, and it had not changed as much as she had hoped it would, and his eyes had done the thing they did when he was managing a strong feeling, that specific stillness, and she had dropped the ladle and run, and now she was in the dark against the woodshed wall with nowhere to go. She did not hear him come across the yard until he was perhaps 6 feet away. He stopped there. He did not come closer. She could see his shape against the lamplight from the inn's back door, tall and still. "Cecily," he said. He had said her name in the kitchen without meaning to, and now he said it again with complete intention, the way one drives a stake into ground to mark that it will not be moved. She said nothing. "I am not going to pretend I did not see you," he said. "I want to be clear about that." "My lord," she said, and her voice came out steadier than she had any right to expect of it. "I believe you are mistaken." The silence afterward had a quality she remembered from their 8 days of marriage. He did not fill silences with argument. He let them sit until the other person either said more or found the silence too heavy to carry. She found it too heavy to carry. "Please," she said. "Leave it alone. You have a life. Leave it alone." "You have been here," he said, "in Thornwick, for how long?" 7 years. She heard the breath leave him. She felt it from 6 feet away, the way you feel a change in the air when something enormous moves. 7 years, he said. And the 2 words carried no accusation and no anger, and somehow that was worse than both. Agnes Croft kept the knowledge in the way of a woman who understood that some truths are a person's own to carry. She had known Cecily's real name since the 2nd year, when Cecily had been feverish herself with a winter cold and had said Edmund's name in her sleep and woken to find Agnes sitting beside the bed with her practical face wearing something that was not quite a question. Agnes had not asked. Cecily had told her because Agnes's not asking was more than she could hold against. Agnes had kept it, as she kept all things she considered private, absolutely, without comment, without the faint edge of drama that smaller women brought to the keeping of other people's secrets. It was Agnes who found Cecily in the woodshed. "He's not leaving," Agnes said in her plain way. She paused in the doorway with her hands folded, which was Agnes's manner when she had more to say, and was deciding whether to say it. "I should also tell you. So you know the shape of it." Miss Wren's companion spoke to one of the other travelers at the parlor door this afternoon. "I was bringing linen, and they had not heard me come," she said. And here Agnes's voice went flat in the way of a woman quoting something she found distasteful, without editorializing about it. That there seemed to be some trouble with the kitchen girl imagining herself acquainted with the Baron, and that the Baron had a history of being kind to those beneath him, to his own inconvenience. That was the phrase. The kitchen girl. Agnes looked at her steadily. "I thought you should know." Cecily held very still. She had known since that afternoon, since the groom in the yard who had not looked at her face, that this was how the world had her filed. The innkeeper's girl. The kitchen girl. These were accurate descriptions, and she had no quarrel with accuracy as a practice, only with what accuracy applied like a verdict was designed to accomplish. Mrs. Garth has gone up, and Miss Wren is in the parlor with her embroidery, and the solicitor is having supper, and Lord Halford is sitting in the back garden in November without a coat. He will catch his death. I've told him so, and he told me it was none of his concern. He will go in the morning, Cecily said. He has business at Thornwick Grange. He told Mr. Beecham his business can wait, Agnes said. She looked at Cecily with the particular expression that meant she had an opinion she was choosing not to voice. Come inside. The fire is low, and someone needs to see to it. The inn's kitchen in the hour after supper was the quietest room Cecily knew. The cook was gone, the scullery maid finished, the pots cleaned, and the table scrubbed, and the fire banked for the night. Cecily had always found the kitchen beautiful in that hour, which was something she had never told anyone, because it would have sounded like the observation of a woman with too little to want. She had not known, in that quiet hour before Beecham arrived, that she had been watched. Earlier that evening, before supper was cleared, she had been called to the back storeroom by the innkeeper's wife. There was a merchant named Fowler who had arrived with an invoice for November flour, and the sum was wrong. Cecily had seen it the moment Agnes placed the paper in her hands, a small transposition of figures that would have cost the Crofts 11 shillings above the agreed price. Fowler had been doing business with the inn for 4 years, and had, she suspected, been doing this particular kind of business for most of them. She had not raised her voice. She had brought the original contract and the merchant's own delivery ledger from the shelf where she kept the records, and she had set both documents alongside the invoice on the kitchen table and pointed to the discrepancy with her finger, and she had said that she supposed it was a copying error, and that she would be glad to wait while he corrected it. Fowler had gone red, and then pale, and then had corrected it. He had left with a speed that suggested he understood the matter was settled. She had not watched him go. She had returned the documents to the shelf and gone back to the kitchen, and she had not noticed the shadow in the corridor where the lamp did not reach. Edmund had been looking for the innkeeper. He had taken a wrong passage and found himself at the entrance to the back storeroom, and he had stopped because she was there, and he had watched her. He had not meant to watch. He had simply found he could not leave. She had not performed the thing she was doing. That was what he remembered afterward, standing in the garden in November, the image of her in the lamplight working through the figures with the steadiness of someone who had done necessary things for so long that necessity had become its own kind of grace. She had not been showing anyone anything. She had simply been doing what wanted doing, and that was the whole of it. He understood, standing in the passage where she could not see him, that this was what she had always been, that this was what the 10 years had not taken. She had finished banking the fire and was wiping down the last of the work table when she heard a sound from the passage and turned to find not Agnes, but a man she did not know standing in the kitchen doorway. He was perhaps 60, compact and careful-looking, with the particular neatness of a solicitor or a man of business, and he held his hat in both hands and regarded her with an expression she could not immediately name. "Mrs. Peel," he said, "forgive me. Mr. Beecham, I have been Lord Halford's man of business for 22 years. She said nothing and went back to wiping the table. "I have been," he said, "in that time, occupied with a question that has resisted resolution. A question about the original marriage documents. Lord Halford does not know I have been pursuing it. I began because something in the registered death certificate did not correspond with the physician's records in London, and I am the kind of man who finds inconsistency uncomfortable." Cecily's hand stopped on the table. The physician's name on the certificate, Mr. Beecham said, was one Josiah Fenn. Dr. Josiah Fenn had his license revoked in 1807, 2 years before your marriage, for falsifying death records on behalf of parties who were willing to pay for the service. I could not find this information for 3 years. I found it eventually. She turned. He regarded her without triumph, without accusation, with the specific gravity of a man delivering information he has carried for a long time and is relieved to set down. "The annulment document," he said, "if you have it, was executed by a solicitor named Gerald Croft. He was struck from the rolls in 1810. His instruments from 1809 through 1810 are legally void. The annulment is not valid. It has never been valid." He paused. "I should very much like to see the document, if you have kept it, for the purposes of confirmation." The document was in Cecily's room under the eaves in a folded paper sleeve she had not opened in 4 years, because the looking was never worth the cost. She retrieved it. She brought it to Beecham. He examined it with the focused attention of a man who knew exactly what he was looking for, and found exactly what he expected to find. "As I thought," he said. He folded it with careful hands. Lord Halford's marriage to Miss Cecily Ashmore of Doveridge is and has always been legally binding. The marriage was never dissolved. You are, and have been for 10 years, Lady Halford. He looked at her steadily. I suspect there are things you will wish to say to him, and things he will wish to say to you, and I intend to remain entirely out of the way of that conversation. I am telling you this, only so that you know the ground you are standing on before the morning. She stood in the kitchen with the fire banked behind her and the cold air coming under the door, and she understood all at once that the thing she had held against her chest for 10 years like a stone had not been the truth. It had been a very good forgery of the truth. The tears, when they came, were not the dramatic kind. They were the quiet kind, the kind that arrive after you have been very controlled for a very long time and have forgotten that you were holding something, that you... Agnes found her before the crying was finished and sat beside her on the kitchen bench without saying anything, because Agnes was the kind of woman who understood when words were beside the point. He does not know, Cecily said finally. No, Agnes said. Beecham is keeping it until you've decided what to do with it. I have to tell him. Yes, Agnes said. You do. The morning came with frost on the yard stones and a sky the color of pewter. Edmund was in the small garden when Cecily found him, standing very still beside the bare rose arbor, with his coat collar up and his hands behind his back, looking at the low Derbyshire hills as though they had said something he was still considering. She had brought him the document. She had brought him the physician's original letter, which she had also kept, and Beecham's own notes on the matter. She held them in both hands without her gloves, and felt the cold on her fingers, and thought of nothing in particular, because the only thing that would have been worth thinking was too large to approach directly. He turned before she reached him, as though he had known she was there. She stopped 3 feet away. She held out the papers. He did not take them immediately. He looked at her face for a long time, the way he had been looking at things all his life, with that specific measuring stillness that was not coldness, had never been coldness, was something quite different that she had simply not had enough time to learn to read. Will you tell me, he said, what happened? She told him. All of it, in the plain, direct way she had decided 10 years ago to bring to everything because dishonesty took more energy than she had ever had to spare. The fever, the physician, the room in Shrewsbury, her father's document, the decision not to return, the 7 years in Agnes's kitchen. She did not soften any of it. She did not ask him to understand it. She laid it before him like the accounts, accurate and complete. When she finished, he was quiet for a long time. You thought I had moved on, he said. I thought it was the reasonable assumption. I did not move on, he said. He said it the way he said most things, levelly, without drama, as though it were simply information that deserved to be on the record. I searched for 3 years. I have not remarried. I have been, for the past 2 years, agreeing to nothing, while being given to understand that I ought to be agreeing to something. I have managed it by indefinite delay, which is not a technique I recommend. A pause. I mourned you, he said, accurately. It was not a performance. She said, I know. I believe you. And she did. She had always believed it, which was part of what had made the decision not to return so difficult and so necessary and so entirely wrong in the end. He took the papers from her hands. He read them with the focused attention of a man who was also an attorney's son and had learned to look at legal language as a thing to be tested rather than accepted. He read Beecham's notes. He read them again. Then he said very quietly, "Cecily." Not Lady Halford, not Mrs. Peel, just her name, the way he had said it twice the previous evening, and she felt it in the same place both times. "Your father is dead," he said. "He died in Brussels in 1814. Beecham located the record." He looked at her. "There is nothing left to be managed. Only what we decide." What they decided took the rest of the morning to say, and the saying of it was not simple. There was grief to be named, real and specific on both sides. There was the decade of separate lives to be acknowledged, the choices made under imperfect information, the things that would not come back. Edmund said these things with the honesty she had come to understand was his natural register, and she said them back, and they stood in a frost-covered garden in Derbyshire in November, and were truthful with one another, which was not the least of what they owed each other. He did not tell her what to do. This was important, and she noticed it. He laid before her what was true and what was possible, and he asked her what she wanted. She wanted the kitchen at the Crossed Keys, which was hers. She also wanted, with a clarity she had not let herself feel for a decade, not to want only that. She said both things. He said very quietly, "Then we will settle it." There was still the question of the dining room and of Mrs. Lavinia Garth. Mrs. Garth had, at luncheon, become aware that something unusual was occurring. She was a woman of considerable social intelligence, and the intelligence told her that Lord Halford's solicitor had been in private consultation with the kitchen girl, and that Lord Halford himself had spent the morning in the garden with the kitchen girl, and that Lord Halford's manner at the table was not the manner of a man about to announce an understood engagement to a family that had been waiting 2 years for the announcement. She applied herself to the situation with the directness of a woman who has come too far to retreat politely. "Your lordship," she said over the cold meat, "I understand there has been some disturbance with one of the inn servants. I want to assure you that Portia and I do not consider it of any significance. These things happen when one travels." She did not look at Cecily, who was refilling the water jug at the sideboard. The kitchen girl is clearly overwhelmed by company of this quality. It is quite understandable. The dining room held 8. Portia sat at her mother's left. 2 other travelers occupied the far end of the table. Beecham sat nearest the door. Agnes stood in the doorway with her particular expression of a woman who has been waiting for something and finds herself, now that it has arrived, entirely prepared for it. Edmund set down his fork. He looked at Mrs. Garth with the specific quality of attention he brought to things he had decided about. Then he rose from the table. He crossed the room to the sideboard where Cecily stood with the water jug, and she watched him come the way one watches a thing that is happening at a speed that is both very slow and very certain. And she did not step back, which was, she understood afterward, the first choice of many choices. He took the water jug from her hands and set it on the sideboard, and then he turned to face the room. "She is my wife," he said. "She has always been my wife." The dining room went very still. Mrs. Garth's fan had been moving with the unconscious rhythm of a woman at ease. It stopped. Edmund said without raising his voice, "Mr. Beecham will confirm the legal particulars for anyone who requires them. The short form is this. Lady Halford was separated from me by fraud 10 years ago. The marriage was never legally dissolved, and she is and remains my wife, and will be returning to Halford Grange when I leave Thornwick tomorrow morning." He looked at Miss Wren, because Portia deserved to be looked at directly, and his expression carried neither apology nor indifference, but something honest. "I am sorry, Miss Wren. I should have resolved this question with greater clarity before this point. The fault is mine. Portia sat very still with her hands folded on the table. She was a composed young woman, and she showed it now. She said quietly and without cruelty, "I see." And then, because she was also a good-natured woman who had always found the understood engagement rather more her mother's project than her own, she said, "I hope you will both be very well." And she meant it. Mrs. Garth did not speak immediately. The mechanics of her situation were working through her in the way of a woman who has been comprehensively outmaneuvered and is deciding between grace and its opposite. She chose, in the end, a version of grace, because she was not a cruel woman, only a determined one, and determination without an object to press against deflates quickly. She said, after a moment, "I see that I have been laboring under a significant misapprehension." She said it evenly. It cost her something. She paid it. Beecham rose from his chair. He produced the relevant documents from his coat, with the air of a man who has been carrying them for exactly this purpose, and was glad to be relieved of them. He confirmed the legal particulars with the measured specificity of a solicitor who had spent 13 years pursuing this particular inconsistency, and found the resolution entirely satisfying. The two other travelers at the far end of the table exchanged a look and went back to their cold meat, with the discretion of people who understood they had witnessed something and were choosing to be gentlemen about it. Cecily stood at the sideboard through all of it. And the quality of that standing was not the quality of a woman waiting to be spoken about. It was the quality of a woman who had set down a very heavy thing and was learning what it felt like to have her hands free. Agnes caught her eye from the doorway. Agnes's expression said several things at once, the primary one being satisfaction of a deeply practical kind. That evening the frost came back harder, and the kitchen fire was built higher to manage it. Agnes made herself scarce with the particular tactfulness of a woman who has been waiting 7 years to be tactful. Cecily sat at the kitchen bench, and Edmund sat across from her with his elbows on the scrubbed table, in a way that no baron should sit at a kitchen table, and they talked for 3 hours about everything they had not been able to say in the garden, because the garden was for the large things, and the kitchen was for the true ones. She told him about the accounts she had been keeping for the Crofts, the merchant who had been trying for 6 months to overcharge them on the November flour delivery, the small act of precision by which she had identified the cheat, and documented it, and presented it to Agnes with a letter the merchant could not dispute. Edmund listened with the specific quality of listening that she had forgotten, the kind that did not prepare a response while you were still talking. "You defended their livelihood," he said. "I balanced their accounts," she said. "The accounts did the rest." Something happened in his face. Not quite a smile. Something quieter than a smile and more durable. "You have not changed," he said. "In 10 years. You have not changed at all." She thought about the gray gown and the cotton cap, and the kitchen she had made her own, and the decade of careful invisibility. She thought she had probably changed in every external particular. And then she thought that perhaps he was looking at something else, the thing that had not changed. And she allowed herself to believe that he was right. She reached up and unclasped the locket at her throat. She had not opened it in 7 years. The catch was stiff, and she worked it with her thumbnail until it gave. Inside was the miniature he had given her on their wedding morning, a small painted portrait of her face at 18, and she had carried it concealed under her kitchen linen every day for 10 years, without fully understanding why, except that it had been the only thing that was entirely her own. She set it on the table between them. He looked at it for a long time without speaking. "I thought of having one made of myself," he said at last, "for you to carry. I thought I would give it to you when I arrived at the Grange." He looked up. "I did not get to give it. You can give it now," she said. He looked at her, and the decade was in that look, all 10 years of it, the grief and the searching, and the managed acceptance and the inability to recover. And she looked back at him with her own 10 years in her face, the Shrewsbury room, and the forged document, and the choice she had made under imperfect information, and the kitchen she had built into a home out of the materials available, and neither of them said anything because neither of them needed to. He reached across the table and picked up the locket carefully, the way he had held her hand in the carriage on their wedding day, and closed it and set it gently back in her palm. They left Thornwick the following morning before the frost had lifted from the yard stones. Agnes stood in the inn doorway with her hands folded in front of her, which was the closest Agnes came to open sentiment, and Cecily embraced her for a long time and said nothing that needed to be said aloud because Agnes already knew it. The road to Halford Grange ran north through bare-limbed country, the Derbyshire hills pale and still in the November cold, and Cecily sat across from Edmund in the carriage and looked out at the landscape, and found that it was beautiful in the particular way that things are beautiful when you have come a very long way to see them. She had not known what to expect of the Grange. She had been 20 years old and newly married, and on her way to see it for the first time when the fever struck. And the picture she had carried since was made up of what Edmund had told her in their 8 days together, which was not much, because he was not a man who talked about himself at length, but who answered questions with great care when asked. She had asked him about the Grange, and he had said it was old and cold in the east wing, and had a library with more books than he had ever counted, and a garden that was better in summer than winter, and a view of the hills from the upper rooms that he found he needed the way some men needed society. The view from the upper rooms was exactly as he had described it. She stood at the window of what was plainly intended to be her sitting room, because someone had thought carefully about which room caught the right light, and the Derbyshire hills were pale and still, and the sky was beginning to clear at its edges, and she thought about the October fog she had found beautiful on the morning after their wedding, and considered that she had been consistent in her appreciation of atmospheric conditions. Edmund stood in the doorway. He had been watching her look at the hills, with the specific quality of attention she had spent 10 years trying not to think about. "The garden is better in summer," he said. "I know," she said. "You told me. The east wing is still cold." "I gathered." "The library," he said, "has more books than I have ever counted." She turned from the window. "Then I will count them," she said. Outside, the last of the frost on the window glass was beginning to release. The hills held their pale winter color. Below, she could hear the house going about its business, the ordinary sounds of a household that had been waiting, without knowing it was waiting, for the particular person who was now standing in the upper room counting the ways a place becomes a home. She reached up and touched the locket at her throat, warm from her skin. 10 years was a long time to carry something in the dark. It was also, she thought, exactly long enough to understand the weight of what you had and what it meant to set it down in the right place at last. If you have stayed until the end of Cecily's story, leave a word in the quiet space below. She kept going for 10 years in a Thornwick kitchen. Some stories deserve to be witnessed. The fire in the upper sitting room caught at last, and the light it threw across the old stone walls was the warm, particular light of a room that is decided to be lived in. And somewhere in the library below, he opened the first of the uncounted books,